want to promote your business? Do you want to talk about your nonprofit organization? Do you want to talk about your culture? Introducing the online web TV, Afrique Today. Longham, where you can watch us live at the same time on 4 platforms: Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and using the Afrique Today app. Download our app today for Android or Apple. Promote your business today. For more information, go to www.afriquetoday.com. Afrique Today, the best of digital TV. Want to promote your business? Do you want to talk about your nonprofit organization? Do you want to talk about your culture? Introducing the online web TV, Afrique Today. Longham, where you can watch us live at the same time on 4 platforms: Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and using the Afrique Today app. Download our app today for Android or Apple. Promote your business today. For more information, go to www.afriquetoday.com. Afrique Today, the best of digital TV.
evening and welcome. We want to thank you all out there for coming on today and following us here on American Africans United. And we want to thank Afrique Today for always being here to host us with our every Friday show. You have me, your host, Dr. Yvette Butler Yaboa, and my co
The
host,
Invisible Man.
and he's invisible because you'll never see him, but maybe one day we'll get a glimpse of him. And so we're really excited today. I think we're so excited today because remember last week we were talking about we spoke with judges and just on to just be elected. And we really got into some interesting conversations about mass incarceration. So, as you know, with our new administration coming in and things happening, we definitely want to see how we can look at things differently in this country for those of us. So, we have a very interesting show today for you. We're excited, very excited to have our special guest back with us today. We have, well, say former Judge Murphy, call him Billy. He is now an attorney and has a huge practice with Murphy, Falcon, and Murphy. And we're really excited to have him back on today because he is a true historian as well, as far as mass incarceration and what it really means. But before we introduce him or before we have him come on, we want to show you a quick video because, as you know, we always start our show with videos. Now, last week we didn't, but this week we're going to a little history lesson as far as really the origins of mass incarceration, because that's what we're about today. Like talking about mass incarcerations, origins, and solutions. So, can we have the a real quick video before we start? And remember, this is a live show. You'll see the number to call in, so you can definitely call in. And callers and listeners out there, we want you to call in today because we need you to be part of this discussion as far as mass incarceration. Can we have the video, please?
Though emancipated from the fields of slavery, today many experience the same bondage through the cells of a prison. Mass incarceration is a massive system of racial and social control. Since 1970, our incarcerated population has increased by 700%. Approximately 2.3 million people are now imprisoned, but of this number, black men make up 40.2% of all prison inmates. And though it may be hard to perceive, there are more African American men in prison and jail or on probation and parole today than were slaves before the start of the Civil War in the 1860s. Many believe that mass incarceration is simply slavery by another name. And though the 13th Amendment was written to abolish slavery, some fail to recognize the clause that allows for enslavement as punishment for a crime. Scholars, activists, and prisoners have linked that exception clause to the rise in a prison system that incarcerates black and brown people more than white people and profits off of their unpaid or underpaid labor. It is said that African American defendants are 11 times more likely to receive the death penalty than their white counterparts. 1 in 3 African American babies will end up in jail. Private prison developers use 3rd and 4th grade reading scores to determine how many future prisons to build.
So we wanted you to just see a little bit about some of the statistics of what is going on in this country and since 1970. But let's go back to some of the origins. And so we want to bring our special guest on today, Billy Murphy. Please, thank you so much again for joining us this evening. And could you please, first of all, tell us a little bit about yourself and your background, and then can you answer what is really mass incarceration, some of the origins?
I started practicing law in 1970, but before that, I went to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and got my degree in electrical engineering with a minor in propaganda theory. And propaganda is how you move somebody's point of view from point A, where you don't want it, to point B, where you do want it, without them knowing that they're being manipulated. That's the theory of, that's what propaganda is, and that's the theory of how, of what you're doing. And so from there, when I started practicing law, I originally started in my father's firm with the idea that we were going to practice together and continue and expand that firm. My father's firm started in 1947. I joined him in 1970 for about 9 months, and he got elected judge on me. He ran against an incumbent judge, and lo and behold, he beat him badly. So he became a district court judge. That's our misdemeanor court judge in Maryland, and he sat for 34 years. 10 years later, after being primarily a criminal lawyer, I ran against the sitting judges, the ones who'd been selected by the governor, and I beat one myself. And Bob Bell, who became the chief judge of the court, was the sitting judge, and we both won overwhelmingly. It was a field of 5. I defeated one of the 5. Judge Bell was one of the 5, and so I supported his candidacy as though it was my own. Fast forward 3 years later, I leave the bench to run for mayor of Baltimore. I was unsuccessful, and I went back into the private practice, but I learned from being a judge that there was a whole area of practice that black folks were shut out of, and it was multi-million-dollar litigation on the civil side. And so I went into that, and my first case was 1984. I settled it for $3.7 million on the eastern shore of Maryland, where the highest verdict in that county had never been over $100,000. And that was the renewal that my practice needed, and I went on from there to represent lots of people, represent Puffy, I represent Russell Simmons, I represent Ben Chavis, I represent all kinds of folks. I represented Carmen, I represented Mary J. Blige, I represented Missy Elliott, represented Timberland. There were a bunch of folks that I represented, and I still represent Puffy, and I still represent Russell Simmons. Represented Don King in his major criminal prosecution, and he was acquitted. I represented Microsoft. I represented against Johnny Cochran and Willie Gary, and we prevailed. They sued Microsoft for a combined $8.5 billion for discrimination, but it turned out to be a bogus case, and we had no problem ripping it apart. And I represented Scottsdale Insurance Company in a huge lead paint case in New Orleans. I represented Johnson & Johnson in a huge multi-billion-dollar case in New Orleans in the federal court. And I'm telling you only about the ones I won because I don't want to tell you about any I lost. So, I've had a good career. I've had a pretty good career, and one of my specialties has always been police brutality litigation. I learned a lot prosecuting or cross-examining the cops. They usually lie. There's some honest cops, but they're hard to find. They believe that they're always going to be believed by the judiciary. And in the beginning, they used to be believed by jurors because thinking of jurors was, why would a police officer lie? Well, they lie for multiple reasons. They lie, first of all, because they can, and they get away with it an overwhelming percentage of the time. You rarely see a police officer prosecuted for perjury. They get away with it, and they do it because it's easier than doing the actual criminal investigation. I found that it was pretty easy to bust it up, to reveal it, because if they call one police officer to describe what happened, I'd call the other two in my case, and it would be 2 and 3 different stories. And jurors didn't want to hear that. And plus, the police were getting an incredibly bad name at the same time, and so the will to believe a police officer was shrinking rapidly all over the country because of police misconduct and because of the prevalence of police perjury. And people had no longer had any faith that if they ever had any to begin with in the criminal justice system. And so it became harder and harder for prosecutors to get convictions. And so I was one of the leading guys in that movement to uncover police perjury and make sure juries knew it. Now I do a lot of police brutality work. My first police brutality case was in 1978. And I got a $1.5 million verdict for a guy being shot while he was on the ground, and the police officers on top of him. He took his gun out and just pointed it at him and shot him. He survived, but he lost a considerable amount of his intestines and whatnot. And that was the Maryland record. There had never been a police brutality verdict that high before. And quickly that got, that set the tone for other lawyers, and they got bigger verdicts. And then finally I topped them all with a $44 million police brutality verdict for a man who had been run into the back of his cell by an officer who had no business in the cell anyway. My client was drunk and he was talking about a white woman police officer in rather overtly sexual terms. So this cop had nothing to do with my client's arrest, took it upon himself to get the keys to the cell from the desk sergeant, unlocked the door, go and grab him by the back of the neck and the belt, back of his pants, and ram him while running into the head first into a brick wall in the back of the cell, and it paralyzed him from the neck down. So that was a $44 million verdict. I've gotten verdicts of $185 million, $270 million, $276 million. I've gotten settlements totaling over $1 billion for our clients, and that number is climbing. And recently I got a $20 million verdict in a police-caused death case. Police officer shot my client to death for no reason, and that ties the record for the highest death case police brutality verdict in the country. So we're pretty proud of that. That just occurred in Prince George's County, Maryland. And it's work we're passionate about because somebody's got to do it. We enjoy doing it, and we get great results.
Great. Well, that is so impressive, I'll tell you. But let's talk about mass incarceration, and then we're going to get to some of the other stuff and some solutions. But can you tell us what your definition of mass incarceration is, and some of the origins of mass incarceration?
Well, mass incarceration is essentially the over-incarceration of black people in an intentional way. It started with Richard Nixon. And when I began practicing law in 1970, there were only 165,000 prisoners total in all of the state and local prisons across the country, including the federal prisons. Imagine, 165,000 prisoners. Richard Nixon got so mad at black people and hippies, both because they were against the war in Vietnam and because of the civil rights movement, that he targeted us, and he created what he called the war on drugs. And there was a federal statute that he had passed that I think it was called the Safe Streets Act, which put 5 times the number of police officers in the black community. And it was on. From that point, it began to rise dramatically. And then when Ronald Reagan became president, it really went sky high. He was one of the worst. He was a completely racist president. And his racism was recently exposed because a tape was discovered where he was talking about black people, specifically African leaders, in the worst possible racist terms. So we always knew Reagan was a racist, but he had that smile and he nodded his head to the side and he was like America's father. And nobody wanted to hear that at the time, cold-blooded racist. And then it went up again even worse under Bill Clinton, because Bill Clinton used to say, nobody is going to be harder on crime than me. Nobody. Nobody can ever say I wasn't hard to the max on crime. except we became the victims of that ugly episode and his participation in the increase in mass incarceration.
Can you say
Now,
right? I would say right now what's going on in the country. Can you see there's an epidemic of incarceration of us here in America?
well, look, when Donald Trump became president, his philosophy was to indict and convict people on the highest possible charge you could get. And he instructed his attorney general, the little guy from Alabama, who was a little racist himself, to do that. And so Trump actually revved up mass incarceration after Barack Obama tried to rev it down. And for the last 4 years, it's been mass incarceration part 5. And hopefully Joe Biden will reverse the course. Now Trump gave the illusion of being in favor of criminal justice reform, but he really wasn't. And of course, we have a new ally, new meaning over the last 5 or 6 years, the Koch brothers, because one of their prized executives was prosecuted, and he could only be saved by about a $4 or $5 million investment in great lawyers and legal fees. And when the Koch brothers saw how unfair the federal system was, they decided after that experience of narrowly getting that executive acquitted, after spending all that money, that for black, they understood immediately how bad it was for poor black people who had to use public defenders or had lawyers who just couldn't deliver the goods because they weren't getting paid enough. Various court-appointed lawyers who are underpaid to this day at ridiculously low wages in the federal system and are dismotivated to do all of the things that have to be done, the many, many things that have to be done to assure that your client's going to get a fair trial or even better, an acquittal. Because most people who are guilty don't, and I'm not saying most people are guilty, but people who are guilty don't want a fair trial. They want to win the case, and I specialized in that. Because usually the prosecutors were, compared to me, very inexperienced. They didn't see all of the issues that you learn to look for over a period of years. And so they were no match. But as I tell people, I didn't fatten my record with a degree of pride. You know, that's like bragging that you're a marksman because you're shooting fish in the barrel, or bragging that you're a fisherman. You're neither. It's fish in the barrel. And so my record became about 91% not guilty over 350 jury trials, and higher than that in bench trials in the lower courts. And I don't say that I did that because I was the best lawyer. My opposition was just pitiful, because prosecutors who prosecute black people usually don't have opponents, and they're not ready for somebody like me. And that was my experience. And so I just knocked them down like they were bowling pins, just knocked them down over and over and over again, because they were no match, because they were not prepared, because they never had to be, because it was just black folks. And so you had this defense bar that was representing black people that was totally dismotivated. And so if you could only afford to pay them $1,000 in a big case, they gave you $1,000 worth and you went to jail. Or you got a plea bargain even though you were innocent. And all these things just kept happening, and I got tired of it, which is the second reason I ran for judge in 1980. I wanted to do something about it. I wanted to set the tone. I wanted to be the kind of judge that people would rather be in front of instead of a jury. And if I couldn't give a fairer trial than a jury could, certainly fairer than my fellow judges, there would be something wrong. And I succeeded in doing that. And it was a gratifying experience. But let's talk more about the nature of mass incarceration. You have a prison system that is a larger and larger percentage of which, and Trump brought this back, he reversed the attempted elimination of private prisons by President Obama. And it's pernicious how these prisons, the owners of these prisons act. Their crops are big sentences. The bigger the sentence, the more money a private prison makes. And so you had these groups that were lobbying state legislatures to increase criminal sentence penalties. But they were really fronts for the private prison industry. They pretended to be people who were upset with crime, organizations that were upset with crime, but really they were organizations created by the private prison industry to get higher and higher sentences passed in state legislatures. And they succeeded for a long time. And so the privatization of the prison population became a very, very profitable industry. And we were the crops. Latinos were the crops, and an increasing number of black women and white women became the crops that they were growing to make money on our backs. And it costs about, in the state prison system and the federal prison system, costs about $60,000 a year per Negro to incarcerate us. And that money could easily be spent earlier on in the cycle of black life so that people could be taught to get out of the way of that mass incarceration machine, get a better education, learn more about how the country works, learn more about the political structure, learn more about how to be a productive citizen, rather than to get involved in the dope game or the other things that hurt us in the black community. And we now have generational poverty because all of these black men who were superbly talented got swept up in the mass incarceration movement. People who could run large, legitimate businesses, but chose the dope game, just wasted talent. And as late as 2017, there was a study of the federal judiciary done by an arm of the federal judiciary called the National Judicial Center, which showed that pound for pound, factor for factor, black people were still, as of 2017, 3 years ago, getting 20% higher sentences in the federal system than the equivalent white man. And nobody did anything about it. It was a one-day story. It wasn't scandalous like it would be today, but it hasn't yet been addressed. And so that's our mass incarceration machine. And the book Mass Incarceration describes it as well as anything, and describes the history of it as well as anything. And the book became a sensation and was the single most powerful factor in us reevaluating what was going on. But it wasn't powerful enough to change it. And so it's still happening.
Now tell me, one question I wanted to get to is like, one of the things, what difference is mass incarceration and slavery? Because, and as you talk about that, is it true that the slave patrols were part of the police force in the early, Reconstruction eras? Can you talk a little about that and, just
Well, the
how it
history
came
is pretty easy to
today?
understand. The history is pretty easy to understand. When we became slaves in the 1600s, we were first able to buy our way out of slavery. That window closed really fast. It was first slavery for life, our lives, not our children, but that window closed, and it became slavery for the life of our children too, in perpetuity, forever. And there was no way out. There used to be ways of buying your freedom, but those windows essentially closed pretty quickly. And we, because the only avenue away from slavery was either armed revolt or escape, early on, laws were passed to permit bounty hunters and military people and police officers to track down escaped slaves and return them to their wrongful owner. in very, very large areas of the country. And the most notorious of those laws was called the Fugitive Slave Act. And many a black person who had been set free had papers that were irrelevant to these slave catchers. They take them, put them right back into slavery. And so the police function then was to enforce slavery. We didn't have anything to do with setting up that system. We had no right to vote. We had no influence in politics. We were just out of it. We were like cattle. We were considered subhuman beings to be treated any way that would sustain our productivity without paying us, without properly feeding us, without permitting us to grow within our pre-existing cultures. And it remade the free African who was kidnapped to America. It remade him over generations into a toothless tiger who had lost his will to fight because the odds of fighting this machine were so high. And there was a sense of complete conquest. And, you know, if you imagine what slavery was like generationally, just imagine this lion who's walking in the jungle and he has no natural enemies. He's proud. He's not afraid. Other animals cower in his wake. And all of a sudden he's caught in a rope trap and he's hanged from a tree. And he's shipped off to America to be in some zoo or some circus. And he's put inside a cell. And he knows what he lost. He knows what freedom really was. And he's angry. And if you crack the door of that cell or give him any opportunity to escape, not only will he escape, but he'll kill anybody who tries to stop him. Anybody who resembles his captor, they're in trouble. They're dead. Now his son gets born in the cage. He doesn't know freedom. All he knows is the stories about what freedom was like from his father. And that's not the same as understanding freedom. But he's angry. And he'll follow his father out of the cage. But then grandson's born in the cage. He thinks father's a little nutty, or grandfather's a little nutty. He thinks his father is thinking about the past instead of the three squares that are important. He knows even less about freedom and does not find these tales particularly credible because he can't relate to them given his incarceration. It feels natural to him. He doesn't know how to hunt. He doesn't know what to do if the door is open. He's lost any semblance of things, and he begins to think that it's inconvenient and disadvantageous to escape from the cage, because it really is. Now, we're the 7th generation of lions born in the cage. We don't know what freedom really is like. We don't understand what it's like to be a free white man. We don't understand what it's like to be self-determining in terms of what you can do, where you can work. We don't realize what it's like to get the full benefit of our labor and that we can do anything that we set our mind to do. And so because we haven't had that experience since we were captured in Africa and brought over here by force, half of us being killed on the journey, since we have no memory of real freedom, we have low aim. And Benjamin Mays used to tell the incoming freshmen at Morehouse, failure is not sin, but low aim, that's the sin. And he would call it the 11th commandment, thou shalt not have low aim. Because what's the point in aiming high if it doesn't get you out of the cage? What's the point of dreaming big if it can't result in you making your dreams come true? And that's what freedom is all about. And so we don't have big dreams except in the 2 areas where we were permitted to show our genius: singing and dancing and composing, and sports. And you take any black kid, male or female, they believe that they're going to be a better athlete than the white man, that they're going to be able to jump higher, shoot better, learn the game better. They work their tails off so that 95% perspiration coupled with that genius brain that we're all born with creates these black superstars that dominate every field of athletics, and it creates these black entertainment superstars who dominate the entertainment section. And it creates genius music, like jazz. Jazz is the greatest art form ever invented in America, and it truly expresses black genius in so many ways. But if you go outside of those two areas, oh, you don't have role models. You don't even know who the baddest lawyers are. You're in law school. Somebody asks you, as I do regularly when I go speak to law students, who's the best trial lawyer in America? They don't know, but that black basketball player has the role model of a Michael Jordan.
That is so true.
That black singer's got so many role models too at the highest levels, and they want to be better than them. But let's take the practice of law. We don't feel that way in the practice of law. Take the practice of medicine. We don't know who the baddest doctors are. We don't know anything about the rest of who the giants are, who the role models are, outside of these two narrow areas that please white folks: singing, dancing, and composing, and catching the ball, running the ball, tackling somebody with a ball. Those are the things that we are permitted to do at a genius level because they entertain white people. Now, if you look at this analogy that I've made about the lion in the cage, and understand how far we have devolved from understanding what that lion who was captured understood, then you understand our mindset. And you understand people like the Honorable Elijah Muhammad and Marcus Garvey, who wanted us to leave this country or to stop interacting with white folks while we're in the country, do our own thing, start our own businesses, support our families, stop using drugs, stop using alcohol, eat the proper food, raise your children, have a wonderful wife that you respect. He taught all of these things, and it also taught the black man. He called us the lost found people. It taught us our history. Now, was he completely accurate in his history? No, he altered things in order to motivate black people to be the best we could be. And he motivated Malcolm X to be a superstar leader for us. And he motivated Muhammad Ali to join the fight for racial equality and have something meaningful to say that would motivate people for change. He was a great man. Now, he had flaws. He had lots of flaws. And when Malcolm X discovered those flaws, he broke with him and started his own movement, and then he was assassinated by people who were members of the Nation of Islam for reasons that are not yet clear. So
that's incorrect.
This is the story of the police, and the police have, at every stage of our development, segregation.
Like to say something.
They would make sure that we followed segregation laws and treated us brutally if we didn't. The Reconstruction, they were instrumental in trying to destroy the Reconstruction immediately after emancipation.
Yes.
They continued the role of destroyers of our community and our progress and our progressive thinking to instill fear by the Night Riders and the Ku Klux Klan. And these things became omnipresent parts of black life. And it cowed us. It kept us from voting. It kept us from having the rights that every American citizen is supposed to have. And the police were vital in making sure that whatever the regressive laws, the repressive laws that existed, they enforced them. And then a new kind of slavery developed in 1870. At the height of of U.S. Steel in 1870, it was the biggest corporation in the history of the world. It was a steel manufacturing corporation. They dug the iron ore out of the ground, and they used free black labor to do it, and it would work like this. The guy at U.S. Steel who was in charge of getting more labor would call the local sheriff and say, and this is Birmingham, Alabama, and say, we need about 200 more niggers. And Joe would say, okay, boss, and he'd go out and round them up. And back then, being unemployed was a crime. It was called vagrancy. There were lots of these bull crimes that black folks could be arrested like that for. And the judge would impose a fine on you that you couldn't play, which would extend your sentence. And when you couldn't, the longer you couldn't play, the longer your sentence was extended. And the sheriff would then ship off these black people who had been wrongfully convicted to U.S. Steel, where they'd be worked together, worked to death, literally, and then disappear from the face of the earth. And the evidence of that is all of these unmarked graves that surround the old U.S. Steel site that have recently been discovered. There's an interesting book written about it. It's called Slavery by Another Name. And so that existed, this kind of roundup and making you work for a corporation for nothing as a part of your sentence. That continued until Franklin Delano Roosevelt ended it in 1941. It was called penury. And Roosevelt stopped it because he had a mixed motive. You know, we were getting ready to go to war against the Japanese and the Germans, and we needed every able-bodied citizen to carry a gun and be willing to fight that war. And you know the history of that. And when we came back, of course, we got called nigger all over again. And this time, these black men were trained to use guns. They were trained to kill. They were trained to use explosives. They were trained to be grown men. They came to, the war just toughened them up so dramatically that they weren't going to take it anymore. And so when they came back and they got called nigger, they did something about it. And when the Klan came to their house, they had rifles sitting in their lap on the porch waiting for their butts. And they would shoot back. And for years, I was against gun control. I still am basically against it because I think we need protection against certain elements of racism and certain elements of the police in this country. Because if you don't have something, to defend yourself, you're defenseless. But that's another topic, gun control. So, and I used to debate pro-gun control liberals. As one of the lone voices in the black community that was against gun control. I did that for years. And so, these are the things that worked up to where we are today. Now, to make a good slave, you had to break his will. And that required you to use psychology. Yeah. You had to destroy his culture. And I say his, even though it's blacks males and blacks females. And so this is what they did to us. They took away our religious beliefs. We don't even remember how we used to worship, except some remember Islam. And that was one of the primary religions at the time we were stolen from Africa in the 1400s. Islam had swept West Africa. And it was a very popular religion. And so many of these slaves practiced Islam. And all of that was bred out of us. And we instead were giving an inferiorized form of Christianity that was not a liberation Christianity, because true Christianity abhors slavery. It was kind of false Christianity that caused us to believe there was nothing we could do here and now, so it'll all be taken care of by Jesus after we go to heaven. And that's not the kind of religion that Jesus taught. I mean, Jesus taught the religion of freedom and the joy of experiencing God. And so we got this perverse, not in every church, not in every way. For example, well, I won't give examples because I'll leave some people out. But there are many people who understood how Christianity, as taught by poor white men and by slave owners, was antithetical to our best interests. And so some liberation theology started to creep out of various black churches around the country, but not enough to bring us back our culture, not enough to cause us to remember who we used to be, what our true capabilities were. We were the Egyptians. We were the Nubians. We were the people who built the city of Timbuktu, the great city that eclipsed any city in Europe at its finest. We were the people who built the pyramids. We were the people who invented civilization in Egypt. We were the people who controlled large parts of the world for 5,000 continuous years, and some estimate even 10,000 continuous years. We were the pharaohs.
Can I
We
ask a
were the
question?
queens, and
Yeah, you know,
we've been taught to forget all of that. So whites don't know it, blacks don't know it. We've been taught to forget what happened to us during slavery. How's that relevant to today? What you doing for me now, Negro? No, it's important for us to understand why we woke up in this pile of shit and why we getting punished for stinking. You know what I
that's
mean?
true.
Kids have to
And
understand this.
history is
Adults
so
have to
important.
understand. You
Yes.
know,
And
whites have to understand it, and we don't teach it in any of the public schools. It's forbidden, literally, because they control the money, and they pick these heads of school systems, and this isn't always true. I'd say 95% of the time it's true. Who are scared to death of bucking white folks because white folks control the money. You know the golden rule is he who has the gold rules, and so they had these and the Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison tells this story of how they corrupt the heads of the black colleges and universities so that they are afraid to teach as a required course the history of the Africans stolen into slavery, brutally treated, with their culture destroyed. You don't see that taught as a required course in any of the historically black colleges or universities. You don't see it in the white universities unless it's an elective. Now, what race is gonna choose an elective in African studies?
that's true.
It's a
That's
waste
true.
of time to him. He's not gonna do that. And so, the education that we have furnished is manifestly ineffective in reforming the thinking of whites and
Yes.
reforming our own thinking about who we are, where we came from, and why we're in this terrible situation we're in today in America and
Now,
literally
I
around the
want to give you
world.
some slides that I have too. I want to show some slides for the folks, and that is, I'll tell you, history is so important. So, um, can we show some of the slides, and we want to talk through some of the slides because this has been a valuable, and invaluable history lesson for me personally. And next week, also, we're going to have Dr. Umar Johnson, who actually is talking about how we start training our young people and ourselves and actually having us learn more. So I want you to take a look at the first slide here, and then we're going to roll through the slides. And so this, and can you see the slides on your side, Judge Murphy? Can you see the slides on your side?
Yes, absolutely.
Wonderful,
And
wonderful. I
I
want
love
you to
that
take a look
artist,
at
by
this
the way.
slide and yes, oh, the artist is amazing. And so we want to thank the Invisible Man for pulling these together. But I want you to comment a little bit on some of the slides that we have here. This is the first slide, and we're going to roll through them. And so we want to talk about now, to date, we have over 2.2 million
That's
individuals
a low number.
incarcerated.
It's more like 2.8 million.
2.8 million? I said, well,
When
but
Michelle Alexander wrote Mass Incarceration, it was 2.4 million at the time. It's now roughly 2.8. That's a whole
yeah,
lot of
and
people.
it is day after
But
day,
you're going
year
to
after
show in the
year, it
slide
increases.
how that relates to the rest of the world.
Yeah, so
Yeah,
that's I think we have that slide coming up to show some of the distinctiveness of what is going on here with mass incarceration of us. And here's one. So you want to talk about this one?
well, that pie chart shows how much of a differential between our percent of the population and the percentage of prisoners we have uh, pound for pound that's higher than what's in the general population. So the general population incarcerates about 5% of its population. Well, this slide actually shows how much of the population the United States has compared to the rest of the world. We have 5% of the total population. And this graph over to the right shows that despite the fact that we are 5% of the world's population, we have 25% of the world's prisoners. Imagine that. Let's see the next slide. Now, this shows a graph over time, and there are bullet points. In 1970, there are 352,000 people incarcerated. In 1971, Nixon calls drug abuse public enemy number one, invents the war on drugs, overpopulates the black community with police, changes the system from understanding that drug addiction is a disease into it being a punitive, and started treating that punitively. Ronald Reagan ramped it up significantly in 1980 when he got elected. And 1982 in particular, he declared a new war on drugs. And in 1986, he passed legislation that made drug abuse penalties much higher. In 1988, another act was passed that made drug penalties much higher. 1994 Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act again made penalties higher, and you can see the graph how it just goes up, 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 and up. Now, as of 2010, we were 2.28 million people, mostly blacks and browns, and now that number is 2.8 million. It costs about $60,000, as I said before, to incarcerate an inmate per year. And just think if that money was spent on young people during their formative years, like in programs like Head Start, in scholarship aid, or in creating private schools so we can take the black kids out of the neighborhood, put them in a great environment, educate them about what's going on in the world, bring out their genius, bring out their talents, bring out their abilities, teach them how to be incredibly productive and valuable to everyone else in the world. But that hasn't happened. And so we squander all this money, literally $60,000 times 2.8 million, which could be, now there's some people who belong in jail, but usually not for these incredible sentences. There's some people who deserve life sentences. And there's a big debate about whether or not people who commit acts of terrorism where they kill thousands of people at a time should be permitted to live, should they get the death penalty. All these things are going on. But 2.8 million people in jail, absolutely unjustifiable. Now, let's go to the next slide. Again, this is the beginning. This is the beginning. This is the money that's being made by prison slavery at the top. These are the shackles that ordinarily characterize how we live in prison, and especially when we're out on the road working for free for the white man. This is what happens. The police officer in blue shows you what happens when you disobey what the guards tell you to do. And by the way, there is no justice in prison. There is no fair due process analysis of whether you broke prison rules. It's entirely arbitrary, and people are routinely punished who should not be punished in prison. Prison's a terrible experience. But there's a saying in some black communities across the country that can go underground to about 5, 6, 7 levels. There are federal prisons where the facility is mostly underground because it's a high security facility. And this is a depiction of what that is like. And then, you have this whole problem of putting people in solitary confinement as an administrative punishment for being convicted by a jailhouse kangaroo court. And, solitary confinement is hell. It ruins people psychologically. It's such a traumatic experience, especially for younger prisoners.
Oh,
and younger prisoners are harder to break down. And so they inordinately get put in solitary confinement for long periods. And some of them go absolutely crazy because of it.
well, we have a caller on the line, and I kind of lost connection with you guys for a second there, but we have a caller. Caller, can you state your name, your first name, where you're calling from, and your question, please? And make sure you turn down whatever device you're watching the show on, Carla. So, caller, can you state your first name, where you're calling from, and your question, please? Caller, you there? Okay, can you guys hear me? Let's see if we have, where's our caller? I'm not sure if we have our caller, but I lost you there for a few seconds there. So hopefully we get our caller back on the line. But as we get our caller back on the line, I want to just ask you a question. As an attorney, what would you say the legal statutes that have been used to convict Afro descendants? Is it the same as in other ethnic communities?
Well, yes, I mean, I have the philosophy that any law that is passed that makes it easier to convict an innocent man should not be on the statute books. And I've made that argument on numerous times to knock down so-called law reforms that are really make the system more unfair. And so there are lots of laws. The mandatory minimum sentences, for example, coerced plea bargains. I'll get rid of the mandatory minimum 10-year sentence or the mandatory minimum 15-year sentence if you plead guilty to a lesser charge, because you know we got you. And if you don't plead guilty, you're going to get the maximum. That's a routine conversation in every part of the criminal justice system. It gives the prosecutors tremendous power that they shouldn't have, tremendous leverage to get people who are very often innocent to plead guilty. And because the lawyers don't have the resources to fight the war against conviction,
Hmm.
many people go to jail without having put on their best defense. And that's why I have to stop and pay homage to a guy named Barry Scheck. You probably remember him from being one of the lawyers in the OJ case. He cross-examined a couple of people and was very impressive. He's much more impressive than that because he started these wrongful conviction organizations. These organizations aimed at getting people out of jail who don't belong there because they were wrongfully convicted. Uh, he's written a great book about it. He has inspired these kinds of organizations all over the country. And if there was ever a guy that you know is going to go to heaven, it's Barry Scheck, because so many black people, mainly black men and women, uh, have um, have been freed by these innocence projects, as they're called. There's a Mid-Atlantic Innocence Project in the Maryland, D.C., Virginia area. They get people out of jail at record numbers. Marilyn Mosby, our prosecutor, has a unit aimed at freeing wrongfully convicted prisoners. And it investigates convictions that are suspicious or that people like me call their attention to and say, you need to look at this. This guy looks like he got unfairly convicted. Here's the paperwork. This is the theory under which he got wrongfully convicted. This is the era that under which he got it. This is what was going on during that era. And we're getting more and more people freed from incarceration who are factually and legally innocent, but who got caught up in the machinations of this evil system. And there's a new category of legal practitioners who are coming to the fore, including us, who get people compensation for every year they've been incarcerated. Now, they have statutes on the books where you get peanuts for incarceration, but if you can successfully sue the police for withholding, for example, evidence of your innocence, that would show that you didn't get a fair trial or evidence that established your innocence, then you can get people out of jail. And we got a man named Walter Lomax out of jail who'd served 40 some years for a crime he did not commit, and we got
We
him
know we
a
need more of
tremendous
that
amount
out
in
here.
compensation.
And we need more about it. We have a
So,
few
so
minutes left, but I wanted to ask you, could you just talk a little about some of the emerging populations and how the emerging adults and the over incarceration of our young black men and women just here in the state of Maryland. For our callers out there, we're sorry we had some technical issues today as far as calling in, but could you just please say a little bit about what's going on for those emerging adults and especially how Maryland is leading the charge?
well, a report came out either last year or the year before last that established that our treatment of juvenile offenders is abysmal and totally unfair and perhaps totally unconstitutional. We have a system where we treat people as young as 10 years of age as though they're adults. I've represented a 10-year-old who shot somebody accidentally, and he got prosecuted, or they attempted to prosecute him as an adult, and I foiled that. And then the case fell apart because we did an investigation that showed that they had the facts completely wrong. And so we were able to save him. But imagine what would have happened if he didn't have a hardworking lawyer. Imagine what would have happened to him. And so we're getting all these juveniles flooding the system. And some of them have gotten life imprisonment as juveniles. And currently in Maryland, there's a battle between Governor Hogan and the rest of us about doing away with life sentences for juveniles. There's a statute that was passed that does away with it, but we haven't been able to persuade him to the fullest extent that he ought to be persuaded to commute the life sentences of a tremendous number of juveniles in the system. And that same Walter Lomax has dedicated his life now that he's out of prison to that cause. And that's a cause that needs backing. That's a cause that needs recognition. That's a cause that needs to win. And so many of us are working on that, as you know. So the
Well,
situation with juveniles is horrible.
Well, I'll tell you, whoever gets you as an attorney is lucky. So you guys heard it out there. I mean, I think this, remember it's Murphy, Falcon, and Murphy. Whoever gets you and your law firm is very, very lucky. So I want to
That's
make sure I
very
put that
kind of
plug
you.
out there because your record is so impressive. I've been looking at some of the stuff and following, and I started following you a couple of a little over a month ago. But then I was like, it was amazing some of the things that you have done in your career, and we want to thank you. Do you have any closing remarks? Because today we talked about just the origins, but we are going to get to solutions as I said when we first started. This is a two-part series. We are going to talk about solutions because solutions are definitely what needs to happen now because we now know the history of what has been happening to us here in this country, in the United States of A, as they call it, America, which has been dismal for people of color. Black people here have been brought to this country under horrific situations, and we are still under attack and horrific life sentencings for folks with the mass incarceration that's happening with our communities. We have to stop it. We have to stop it. So we will be talking about solutions and where we go from here because I got many calls this week about what are we going to do? How are we going to handle this? And we have to start taking control of our communities. And we'll get to the solutions next week. But I want them to say the last final words as far as just give us some last closing thoughts about the origins and where do we go from here? Because we have to change what is happening to us in this country, and the education is is paramount to our communities and not just the black communities, educating all communities across. Because because I believe if everyone's educated about our situations, I think more people will be involved in wanting to see a change. So, Judge Murphy, Billy, would you give us some closing thoughts? And I want to thank you again too for coming on today.
we have a criminal justice system that was designed to be fair, but only if you had enough money to defend yourself substantially, so that if you were innocent, you'd be able to show it. If the prosecution did not have a good case against you, you were able to show it. And all of that takes money. And so what do we get in return? We get a public defender system in almost every state in the union that is dismally underfunded, so that what public defenders and court-appointed lawyers get paid is a dismotivation to do a good job. And this is scandalous because 95% of people who hire public defenders are poor black people. And hiring them is the wrong word. Have them imposed on them. And they are horribly motivated because they don't have the tools that they need to do an excellent job representing these substantially poor people. And so if we don't pay attention to justice in the courtrooms, it's going to be a parade of people who ought not to be sent to jail and who ought not to be, if they deserve to go to jail, getting terribly high sentences. People who are shunted into drug court where they actually have to plead guilty in order to get treatment. And of course, drug addicts often violate their probation, because it takes real time and effort for a drug addict to kick the habit. And so many people are in front of judges who don't understand addiction. They're not expert in it. And so they get their probations violated. They've already been found guilty. Boom, fast track to jail. And we've got to reform our juvenile justice system. It works horribly. The juvenile justice system was created with children in mind who are not yet mature enough to be treated as adults because they make juvenile decisions. And that gets lost when you're black and poor. And if it's a violent crime, forget about it. If it's a crime of theft by the threat of violence, forget about it. And so we end up just pushing and processing juveniles through the system to the detriment of the entire community, black or white, because look at the productivity we're losing. Look at how well these people could fit in, because the lesson today is we're all born with these genius brains. If you ask yourself, who's the smartest, me or my brain, the brain wins every time. We all know we use only a small part of that genius that we all have if we have simply an ordinary brain. An ordinary brain is a genius brain. And so we have been unable to unlock the genius in black people for so long. And you see the result. And it's sad. And we have to be a united community about it. Too often we see the results of oppression in undereducation, resorting to crime, etc. And we get mad at the results of oppression and we take it out on the victims of oppression by saying it's too many drug dealers on the street. True, but the next step is not. And they need to go to jail forever. No, wrong. And that's how we got mass incarceration in the first place, because of the problem we were having in our communities about dealing with the drug epidemic that got larger and larger with no end in sight. Now, compare that to how white folks get treated when they are addicted to heroin. And we have a new word for it, opiates. That's somehow, much more acceptable than heroin addiction. And so we have this opiate crisis, and it affects poor white people, middle-class people, and it's devastating the white community. And we need to treat them like human beings and make sure that anybody who wants treatment gets it. That's never been true in the black community. For every 10 people who are desperately asking for treatment for drug addiction, 2 get it. That's ridiculous. That's ridiculous. So we have a malfunctioning criminal justice system. Pay attention to it. Understand that that all people are the same, mostly average, some geniuses with a liberal sprinkling of fools. And don't judge us by the results of our oppression. Judge us based on our genius brain. And you see the genius brain in sports and entertainment. It's the same brain that we ought to be able to see across the board in every walk of life. That's my
Well, so
story, and I'm
everyone,
sticking to it.
well, thank you so much. So for our listeners out there, I'm really sorry we didn't get the calls in, but you heard it from our former Judge Murphy, who's Attorney Murphy now, with Murphy, Falcon, and Murphy. And one of the things he says, genius. We all have a brain. We all are geniuses. And if we just focus on really bringing that to the forefront and having unity, we will make a difference. So we're going to talk next week about solutions. I want to thank Afrique Today for hosting us again on this Friday, and we look for you next Friday. I want to thank my co-host, and more important, I want to thank my guests for coming back on again today. And we're going to be talking about solutions. It's all about where we go from here now. So once again, I want to thank you all for listening in. Hope you get your calls in next week. Thank you, and we'll see you next week.
And Dr. Butler, thank you so much for the work you're doing, and thank you in particular for inviting me so I could share my ideas with your adoring public.
Oh, yes. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Afrique Today.
Do you want to promote your business? Do you want to talk about your nonprofit organization? Do you want to talk about your culture? Introducing the online web TV, Afrique Today. Fogham, where you can watch us live at the same time on 4 platforms: Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and using the Afrique Today app. Download our app today for Android or Apple. Promote your business today. For more information, go to www.afriquetoday.com.